Welcome back. This is Dr. Dinah with Foundations in Torah and our ongoing series on Hezekiah. I believe we've reached the 10th program in the life of Hezekiah. Now this I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack here. One of the interesting things about his name and how it applies to what he did has to do with the temple. So we find in 2 Chronicles 29, it tells us that he repaired, or he opened and repaired, or opened and strengthened the doors is really how it's, the Hebrew word there is strengthened. So his name is Hezekiah. It comes from the root chazak, and he opened and strengthened the doors of the temple, chazak. So we have a little bit of a play on words here. Again, chazak being the root for Hezekiah. Now the key here that Ahaz, his father, whose name also means a strong one, we find that he's the one who sealed the door. He's the one who abandoned the temple, closed the door. Now, this is not the eastern gate of the wall or anything like that. This is the great gate, or the great door that goes from the porch into the holy place. The porch is kind of its own little room, but it's also a gigantic gate, and the doors there were huge. And it's through this door that this is the door that Ahaz had sealed shut. No one could go in. And so now we have Hezekiah strengthening these doors and allowing the people who needed to be there to enter into the presence of God. Of course, not everyone was allowed to go into the holy place. What's interesting is the holy place was actually an idiom for green pastures in Scripture when you read about in Psalm 23. So when it's talking about green pastures, it's pointing to the temple, and in particular, the holy place. And that was the doorway that we're speaking of, was the entrance into there. So, of course, that harkens us to what Yeshua says about himself, that he is the door through which enables us to enter into the presence of God through that door. And he repeatedly mentions in John that he is the door to the sheepfold. So although he's referring to something physical, he's also speaking of the temple. We can find in Revelation 3, verses 7 through 8, it says, "Here's the message of HaKodesh, the true one, the one who has the key of David, who if he opens something, no one else can shut it, and if he closes something, no one else could open it." So this takes us to the temple as well. So we know that Ahaz was the one who shut it. Hezekiah was the one that opened it or strengthened it. And this key of David has to do with the temple. So in temple times, there was a person called a Rosh Beit Av, which is the head of the fathers of the house. He was responsible to open the temple gates each morning and close them in the evening. And it was kind of a big to-do here. There was a lot to lock up. And the Rosh Beit Av, that group, was a kind of a subset of what we call the 24 courses, or the Mishmarot. They were a division of the families that served each day. And of the Rosh Beit, there were 6 divisions, and again, the head is the Rosh Beit Av. And the great door was into the holy place from the Ulam, the porch, and the one that Ahaz shut. This is the one that would be opened. The eastern gate is in the outer wall of the temple, not the temple building, but the temple complex. It is not the gate that Messiah will come through that is sealed. It could also refer to, there was a small gate to the southern side of the Nicanor gate that was also sealed, and that was in the temple building itself. So it was called the Southern Wicket, and it was right by the Great Gate, and that was also sealed. So more than likely one or the other, probably the Southern Wicket in the case of when we read in prophecy, etc. But people don't understand that, and so when everyone goes to Jerusalem and they're all excited and they go up in the Temple Mount and they all head over to the wall, the eastern wall there of the outside of the Temple Mount area, and all the graves are in front of that wall, and they say that the Muslims put their graves there so that they would make it people unkosher to enter in through that particular gate, but they're not talking about the right gate. So anyways, I digress and we move on. Now, what's very interesting about the door into the holy place, let's just look at the tribe of Judah for 1 second, Yehuda. If you look closely at the letters of Judah, first we have the tetragrammaton, the name of God, the Yod He Vav He. And then if you insert the letter Dalet in between the last two letters, you get Yehuda. So Yehuda, that tribe, is very much associated with the door. The Dalet in Hebrew is a door. And so Yehuda is God with the door, if you will. And so Yehuda is the tribe of Judah, and contains the name of God, and it contains the letter for the door. So by adding the door, it's that I believe Judah is functioning as the door into the presence of God. And of course, for us to understand so much of the scriptures, we have to return to Judah in order Yehuda to be able. They explain to us what much means, because we've lost so much in our Western culture. And so we have a picture of at the time of certainly the tabernacle and the whole community. It was Yehuda that was directly in front of the door of the Mishkan, or the tabernacle, and we can read that in Numbers 2:3. So that is kind of interesting. Now, doors were big deals in ancient cultures, and thresholds were of utmost importance. So doors ended up, it's problematic for us because we have these little doors we go through, that are, barely 4 or 5 inches thick. It's a very different concept when you're looking at a temple and the gods and goddesses of mythologies and their temples, etc. So doors were attached to the sort of exalted personage, whoever that was. For instance, the ancient Roman god Forculus was the household god of doors. And he was the one who actually protected the integrity of the doors. He was responsible to protect the passageway from the realm of the outside to the realm of the inside. These were important concepts in ancient cultures, these passageways. So the idea of going from, if you will, death unto life, and going through a passageway to reach that particular point. So again, the integrity of the doors was basically the place of the shrine for the god, and a very different concept and understanding that what we have. And we don't even think about going through doors, but of course there's a reason why the mezuzah is in the doorway, in the doorpost. We'll talk about that later. So the doorway, the passageway, was the standing place for the gods, and also if it wasn't the god in particular, it'd be the king, who was the representative of that god. The door was then the shrine, if you will, of the one who was being worshipped. So prominence was given to the door for the deity, or the representative, could be the king, of the one who had crossed the threshold. Again, the threshold is a very important place. As they crossed the threshold, it indicated new life. It was a place of shelter and protection, and basically you were seeking asylum under the divine protection of that deity. And so because of that, they would put inscriptions in the lintels and in their doorways to testify to the sacredness of that passageway, going from one realm to the other. That's how they saw it. So now when we come to the temple, what do we see? We have these two great brass pillars in the porch. One of them is called Boaz, the other Yachin. Boaz was on the north, which means in strength, and Yachin was on the south, which meant a base that provides support. So that was the pillar basically standing firm. And these pillars supported the lintel of the ulam, or the porch. And so the inscription in the doorway, in Hebrew, that word is mezuzah. Okay? And so when we are putting the Shema in the mezuzah, or the name of God, or the Shaddai, or quotes from the scriptures, that passageway belongs to our God, if you will. So let me just read from Revelation 3:12. It says, I will make him who wins the victory, a pillar in the temple of my God, and he will never leave it. Now this is pointing to the pillars of Yachin and Boaz, that those who overcome by the blood of the Lamb will be a pillar in the temple and will never leave. Now again, Israel was commanded to dedicate their doorways to the living God versus all the other pagan gods. And you can certainly, at Passover, Exodus 12:7, you're to take the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts. That word for doorposts then is mezuzot, and on the lintels of the house. And these were to testify to God as you did this. So that, again, taken from the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4-9, also Deuteronomy Devarim 11:13-21. So the Shema was the inscription on the doorposts of your gates. So it was that the name of God was inscribed in that doorway, in that doorpost, because that was dedicated to Him. That was His arena. He was the exalted person in the doorway, in the passageway. He was the guardian of the dwelling of the house of Israel, and in particular here, the guardian of the temple, which is the house. And so if we looked at the tabernacle, the Mishkan, it was at the doorway that the pillar of cloud descended when meeting Moshe, when Moshe met God. So that pillar of cloud kind of reminds us of the 2 pillars that are standing at the entryway, at the porch, Boaz and Yachin. And so again, we have this pillar of cloud. That's because it's the passageway. And this is the place in which the Shekinah, the indwelling presence of God, would enter in, because in effect, He owns the doorway, if you will. So as you pass through the doorway, crossing over the threshold, you are subjecting yourself to the covenant obligations of that deity. In this case, our Heavenly Father. We are subjecting ourselves to the covenant obligations of the Torah and of citizenship in that kingdom. Now, looking at the temple, you'll find that there were 12 steps before that particular door. So as you ascended from the court of the women up the 12, you went up the 15 steps there into the Nicanor gate, into the court of Israel, and then just before the porch, as you come up, there's 12 steps there. So this represented a change of status, that you were moving from a lower level of sanctity to a higher level of sanctity. And really every doorway passage was that change of sanctity. So you think about them leaving Egypt and crossing the sea, going down into the sea and coming up on the other side. Same picture, that the sea was actually like a giant doorway, a passageway. And all of this in order for them to return back to Israel, specifically Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple. The context always remains the community. We, unfortunately, in America, see everything in terms of our individual lives, but really this all functions in the context of the community. That's very important. Now, you'll remember when Joshua crossed over the Jordan River, it was the same kind of picture, crossing from one level of sanctity to another as if he was going through a passageway. And he made a covenant with the people. And he set down the decrees and wrote the words of those decrees, and they express it as the book of God's Torah. He took a large rock, kind of like the Boaz Yachin thing. He stood underneath it, and they referred to it as an Allah, A-L-A-H, not Allah, which was a doorpost. Okay, so the idea in the sanctuary was this doorpost. But the Allah was really the place of the yoking together of 2 parties. That's the purpose of the doorway, or the doorpost, or the passageway, where the king or his representative or the deity, it was the place of the yoking together of the 2. So a covenant, of course, speaks of the binding of 2 parties together. It always happened in the passageway, if you will, in the doorway. And it actually mentions in that story of Joshua that the stone itself was a witness because it had heard all the words that God spoke. So you kind of think about Yachin and Boaz being the witness to the covenant. So again, the Ulam was that area before you went into the holy place. It was the entryway into the porch, and that it's kind of like a big gate. There was a splendid veil there. Now, within the porch, it was a large enough area where there was a golden candelabra with golden crowns. There were 2 tables in there as well, one of marble, where they would deposit the new showbread, or the bread of the faces. The other gold table where they lay the old bread was also there when they removed it from the holy place. So they would put the new bread there, waiting to be taken into the holy place where the golden table was, where they could take out the old bread and put in the new. These apparently these massive doors were not actually seen because there was a great, well, they call it a Babylonian tapestry on it. It was a tapestry, but the doors themselves apparently had 2-leaf. They were 2-leaf doors with gold plating, and they also apparently they covered the tapestry covered the doors. Above it hung the symbol of Israel, which is interesting, and the symbol that now this would be in the second temple. The symbol that was there was a grapevine, because the grapevine was the symbol of what we call Knesset Israel, or the community, the gathering or assembly of Israel. So this great gate, the Sha'ar HaGadol, was the main entrance into the sanctuary. Again, it was a large door between the Ulam and the Chechal. That would be between the porch and the holy place. This entryway into the Chechal was called Great, because it was said the holiness of this gate was greater than any of the other gates in the temple. Now, there was, again, a small door on either side, one to the north and one to the south, and we mentioned earlier that it's probably the southern one. It was the one that was sealed. No one ever entered through that southern door. And apparently, it remained locked because of the verse that we have in Ezekiel about it. Now, you can find in Ezekiel 44, and there's a commentary from Tamid 3:7 of the Mishnah. It says, "This gate shall be shut. It was double in size of the other large doors on the Temple Mount. One large curtain covered the opening rather than a door." This is from Ezekiel 44. "The one facing east was shut," that's our southern wicket. "The Shekinah enters through it. Only the prince is to sit there to eat his meal before God. He is to enter through the vestibule or the porch or the ulam of the gate and leave the same way. And this is the place where the covenant meal is eaten, in the doorway, in the gate." Again, the place that the deity resided. And so the ulam was the gateway, the doorway before the holy place. Again, in front of the doors hung this giant Babylonian tapestry. Now, this comes to us from Josephus. Apparently, it was embroidered of blue and fine linen with scarlet and purple. Reminds us a lot of what we have in the tabernacle, the Mishkan. And it was at the entrance to the Chechal, overlaid with the gold inner walls. It was, you could see it through the large opening of the ulam. And apparently there was a construction of 5 carved oak beams right above that particular entryway. It must have been quite something. And above it, they describe it as having 4 crowns. So there were these windows with triangular pediments above them, and they were just above the golden vine. Now, the golden vine, again, is over this door, and the golden vine stood in the entrance of the Chechal on posts. Now, it says, this is from Josephus. He paints a really glorious picture of the ulam, the porch. "Whosoever gave a leaf or a berry or a cluster of gold as a freewill offering brought it, and the Kohanim hung it there." And so this went on in the Second Temple period, and you can find that in Midot 3:8. It goes on to say, "But that gate, which was at the end of the first part of the house, all covered with gold, as its whole wall around it, it also had golden vines above it, and from which clusters of grapes hung as tall as a man's height." Kind of interesting there. And then also from Josephus, "The large face of the ulam, or the porch, was covered with gold, and through it the first edifice was visible to a spectator without, in all its grandeur, and the surroundings of the inner gate, all gleaming with gold, fell beneath his eye." So this curtain was decorated, they said, as the heavens. That was the picture. And again, this was the gate shut by King Ahaz between the Ulam and the porch and the holy place. And what's interesting, let me just read this last thing from Josephus. This is Wars of the Jews. I think it's 5:4. This curtain was decorated as the heavens. It represented the universality or the universal visibility of heaven, and that heaven cannot be excluded from any place. Now, it is more than likely this is the veil that was, now we have it translated rent, tore, but really the word is split, bakah. This was the veil that was split when Yeshua was resurrected from the dead. It was not the two veils between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. The concept of bakah or split is a concept that goes with the redemption. And the redemption begins, the final redemption begins with the resurrection. And again, we go back to Hezekiah. This is the pattern of the resurrection in Hezekiah's life. Remember, he was given the additional 15 years. But the idea of the resurrection meant face to face. Now, it was that the holy place opened up. And to me, the holy place was a symbol of the unity of all of Israel. And we're not there. We'll see that unity come with the resurrection of the dead or the raising up of the nation in Ezekiel 37. And again, out of that word bakah, the holy place, the three pieces of furniture in there are all symbols of the unity of Israel. So we have the 7-branched menorah. We have the table of the bread of the faces has got 12 loaves representing the tribes. And we have the incense, the altar of incense, the golden altar, in which the prayers of the people went up and were a sweet and fragrant aroma before the Father. I believe that the holy place is the perfect representation of the unity of Israel, and that by Yeshua's resurrection, it enable us to experience that, or to be able to enter into the holy place, but not yet the Holy of Holies. I believe when we are finally, now Yeshua is present in the presence of the Father in a resurrected body, living outside the dimension of time, what we sometimes call the 8th day. The rest of us are not. And we look toward that time in which we will be resurrected from the dead, and then we can stand in the presence of God in those bodies outside this physical world, outside the dimension of time. So the temple has kind of that feeling to it of ascending into the presence of the Father, sort of step by step. And there were certain rules and regulations and certain order and the way things were done in order for them to be able to come into his presence. And so that applies to us as well. And we look forward to being able to, if you will, enter into the Holy of Holies, into the very presence of God. Right now in these bodies, we will be burned up, and we cannot stand in the presence of God. Again, that word bakah is the word for split. It's the same word used when the sea was split and Israel passed through. It's the same word used when Abraham split the wood to put on top of Isaac for the burnt offering. It's the same word used in the story of Noah when the fountains of the deep, if you will, split open. And also the same word used when the Mount of Olives split. And we see that in Zechariah. So all this idea of split and bakah goes to something about the redemption. And that's really the key in all this. And so the door or the gate, the veil, however you want to describe it, the curtain, that one was split because the redemption came when Yeshua was resurrected from the dead at that moment. And so this curtain being a picture of the heavens, I've read where the term uses to rend the heavens was the name of this particular curtain. One of the things it allowed when it was opened was for the children of Israel to be able to see into the holy place and see these things of God that they had not seen. And again, I believe it's the place that brings unity. Again, it's also called the green pastures, the sheepfold. And so Yeshua has allowed us to enter into the sheepfold, that is, enter into the holy place. So that kind of concludes this particular session, and we will pick it up next week. Again, I'd like to encourage you to go to my website. That's foundationsintorah.com. You can sign up and be a member. You get a weekly newsletter in which I'm going through the Torah portions this year and trying to show you pictures of the temple. So if you want to learn more about the temple, you can receive that in the newsletter. We'll hear from you next time. Shalom.